Well, hi, good afternoon. It's a little loud. Can we turn it down just a little bit, Elton? Yeah. Okay, so thanks so much for coming down. I know there's lots going on. And so I really appreciate you joining me for an hour or so this afternoon. What I'm going to be talking about today is the awesome orca. But because we've had such a good whale week, I've also included some footage that I thought you would like to see regarding humpback whales, because we've had such a great week. I've just been talking to a couple of people who had a fantastic cruise out of Ketchikan. They went out to see bears and they saw orca. So that's pretty impressive. Did many of you guys go whale watching in Juneau? Yeah, sounds like that was fantastic. Did we see, anybody see humpback whales out in Juneau? Yeah, we saw orca out from Juneau. Yeah, and then hopefully everybody enjoyed those whales that we saw on the evening out from Juneau. Yeah, so that was Frederick Sound, and just to let you know, that's as many whales as I've seen in Frederick Sound, probably in 4 or 5 years. Over the 20 years I've been coming up to Alaska, I've probably seen accumulations in that area 4 or 5 times like that. So it was absolutely special to see that and just to get that feeling of all those whales around us. It was really fun. So we've got one more chance this afternoon as we come down through the waters of Johnston Straits. Johnston Straits is actually renowned for its orca populations. If anybody wants to do a documentary on orca, like the BBC or Discovery Channel or anybody like that, and they really want that orca footage, they're going to come to Johnston Straits, where we'll be in July, which is right now. So anytime from here on in, resident orca come into that area to feed on salmon. I think we're picking up the pilot at 2:30, so it'll be about an hour later as we get into those waters where we really stand a good chance of finding the orca this afternoon. So lots ahead. So for that reason, this presentation is entitled The Awesome Orca. I think of the orca as the whale of the forests, just because when I've seen orca most of the time here in Alaska, they're against that backdrop of the beautiful emerald forests that we see on the Inside Passage. However, they are really a very widely distributed species, and they do actually inhabit all the major oceans of the world. They're one of the most ubiquitous species of cetacean, in fact. So I will be talking about orca. Just wanted to introduce a couple of the other marine mammals we might have seen this time. If you ever looking out from the decks of the ship and you see what looks like a whole pod of baby orca, yeah, and they're sort of very distinctly black and white with a sort of geometric pattern to them. You'll see them pushing through the water and leaving like a whip slash of splashes behind them. And those are Dall's porpoise. Have any of you guys seen Dall's porpoise? Yeah? Okay. If we haven't seen them yet, there's a good chance we'll see them this afternoon. The other small-toothed whale we're going to come across, of course, is this guy, which is the Pacific white-sided dolphin. And the Pacific white-sided dolphin, just to confuse us, is the one that porpoises and leaps out clear of the water. So if you see these guys and you see that lovely sort of very smooth, very blended color right there, then it's Pacific white-sided dolphin. And also we've seen these guys as we come down through Pine Island area, where we'll be about 2:30 this afternoon. So hopefully we'll get a chance to tick off a couple of these smaller cetacea. We'll come on lots of trips to Alaska, and people will only see the Dall's porpoise and the Pacific white-sided dolphin. So we've definitely had one of our best whale watching trips of the season so far this week, for sure. But of course, it was humpback whales that stole the limelight the other night as we came down from Juneau, and we were cruising through the waters of Frederick Sound is where we saw these whales. And just to give you the stats on humpback whales, they're about 40 to 45 feet in length, and they weigh around about a ton a foot. If I was standing at the fluke of the humpback whale right here, the snout would be just about at where those lights are back there. I mean, they are really, to the edges, of the back row of seats there. They are really large animals. They weigh about a ton a foot. If you're thinking sort of ecologically about how they fit into things, from an evolutionary standpoint, their closest living relatives on land are, in fact, pygmy hippos. And if you put them more in amongst that group of hooved, ungulates. So they're in biologically, they're in a group called Cyrtodactyli. And those are our animals with hooves. So things like caribou, elk, even camels. That's the group from within which a small foraging wolf started getting its way back into the water to find food 60 million years ago. That's the early ancestor, the common ancestor to our whales and dolphins. So when we see them in the water, keeping that ecological history in mind, that evolutionary route in mind, you can actually understand the behavior a little bit more and see where it fits. When we see the whales, when we see humpback whales, we see these high standing blows. It's the water that's over the blowhole thrown up into the air, and the force of it causes it to aspirate like this. Whales have lungs the size of small cars. They use about 90% of them when they deflate those lungs. And so it's a real forceful exhalation. So what we see is the blow, and then we see these little dorsal fins, which really don't give us much idea about the whale that's under the water. So when we do see a whale breach like this, have we seen any whale breaches this time? We have, haven't we? It's pretty impressive. Humpback whales don't breach so much here on their feeding grounds as they do in the breeding regions. Breeding regions for these whales would be down in areas such as Hawaii. We also have them going over to the Japanese islands and even down into Costa Rica, Rio de Janeiro Islands, the continental portion, coastline there of the American continent. And so any of those breeding areas will see a little bit more of this behavior, but we do see it here in Alaska occasionally, and I know we saw it a few times this time. Gives us an idea to just look at the anatomy of a humpback whale a little bit. It has pectoral fins that are really important, both in its mating activities, actually, and also in its feeding. It will flash the white to help corral the fish when it's underwater. Those pectoral fins, about 15 feet in length. And then these are the ventral pleats that come down underneath the chin. If I had ventral pleats, they would go from my chin down to about my knees. So pretty attractive, really. And they expand to take in a single gulp of water when the whale is feeding. They'll take in about 15,000 gallons in a single gulp, which is really hard to imagine, really, isn't it? They come to the surface and they can then deflate that ventral area and push the water up through the baleen plates. The baleen plates hang down from the mouth, and in the little fringy ends, the fish get caught. They're feeding on things such as capelin, herring, and small schooling fish, as well as right down on things like krill. So they're really important shapeshifters for krill, we call them sometimes, because they're moving that biomass of krill up into their own body form, and then they excrete a lot of nutrients as well. So they're really important as a biological pump in this system too. Okay, now you can recognize humpbacks. You can tell one from another by looking on the underside of the fluke. On the underside of the fluke, we see a pattern that varies from completely white to completely dark and everywhere in the middle. And it's by keeping track of those patterns that we've actually managed to track an awful lot of the behavior of the migratory behavior of humpback whales. The first match between Hawaii and Alaska was done by a gentleman called Jim Darling, and that was only done about 25 to 30 years ago. So we're just working our way into the science of whales in many ways, and it's pretty interesting stuff. So if you did get a nice fluke picture on this trip, you can actually go to the Juneau Fluke catalog and you can match it, and then you can start matching it into catalogs that are up for places like Hawaii too. So you can track your own whales. I have a personal whale that I look for all the time up here, and it's kind of nice to embrace the whale that you see as well. You can get online and track them all around. Mine is a female that played with us 2 or 3 times now in Hawaii, and I've seen her once in Alaska too. So it sounds a little obsessive, but it's kind of interesting when you get into it. Now, when these whales feed, as I mentioned, they are baleen whales. That baleen hangs down from the upper jaw. On the very fringes of here, it sort of breaks down into something almost like hair, and that's how they manage to feed at this level on the food chain. Because if you think that huge animal, that 45-ton animal, is trying to feed basically on something that size equivalently would be like us trying to feed on house fleas or ticks or caterpillars or something like that, yeah? So all these feeding adaptations we see are so that it can get enough food in a single gulp to make it worth the energy they spend catching the food. So energetically, it all works out. They take this huge gulp of water, push it out through those baleen plates. This baleen just reminds us, of course, we've got 2 types of modern cetacean these days. We've got our baleen whales and our toothed whales. baleen whales are all those big mysticetes that we talk about, blues and humpbacks and rights and fins. All those big guys sit over here in the baleen whale world. And the toothed whales are where we find our dolphins, porpoises, orcas, things like that. If everybody is interested in evolution, it's kind of interesting that it was actually a mutation that caused the breakdown. It caused the breakdown of the building of enamel that led to the whole evolution of the mysticete side of the family tree here, of the evolutionary tree. So there was a mutation that stopped enamel forming properly, and that led to our whole mysticete group. So they're now a really large group. They are spread through all our world oceans, and they do a really good job of resource partitioning. So all different types of whales feed on all different types of food, and it means that we can have a more complex food chain and a more complex ecosystem, which is good. Now, what we saw the other night when we were coming down through Frederick Sound is we glimpsed a little bit of bubble netting, which really surprised me. I think I've only seen that twice on ships, so it was pretty huge. Did we see any bubble netting out from Juneau this time? No? Okay, so it's kind of interesting that clearly the food that they would catch while they're bubble netting was not present around Juneau, but it was present in Frederick Sound, and I think that's why there was so many whales there. When the whales bubble net, what they do is they go down and they literally blow a string of bubbles. So did anybody see that string of bubbles that formed? A couple of you did, didn't you? Yeah, that's great. And so they'll literally sort of blow these bubbles in a circle underwater, exhaling, and they blow all these bubbles, and as the bubbles come to the surface, they expand. And then what the whales do is they make really loud noises to frighten the fish, and the fish school into a ball because they're frightened by the noises. And then once they're inside the bubbly net, for whatever reason, they won't swim through the bubbles. Now, clearly, a fish could swim through bubbly water, but luckily, in the whole picture of things, these fish haven't worked out to do that, so they stay within the bubbles. So it's literally a net of bubbles that comes to the surface, and then one whale gets down below and starts blowing bubbles down there, and they push this whole ball of food to the surface. And then what they'll do is they'll take it in turns to come up in the center of the group right here, and it's an orchestrated pattern that you watch over and over again. When they bubble netting in groups of 12 to 20, they have the exact same sequence each time they come up. And each of them gets a turn to be the main one coming through here, gathering the most of the fish, yeah? And so you see the same sequence of whales, and they'll switch jobs. So each of them gets a turn being the main catcher of the fish, and then everybody else gets plenty on the sides. We found that these groups are led by females, and it's kind of interesting because you don't see the tails as much up here. They actually can ID them by that little patch right there on the jaws. We're finding that a lot of them are very distinct, and it turns out these may be matriarchal groups, which is really interesting. Having said that, although they're led by a female, the members of the group are not genetically related. It seems like a casual bunch of fishing buddies that turn up in the same area year after year, so we know it's the same whales, but we haven't managed to establish any sort of relationships between those whales other than, as I say, this lead female in each group. So they'll come together, they'll form these groups when the food is blooming, and then once the food bloom has passed, the whales will dissipate, wander off on their way, and then, boy, you'll be in a completely different area in Alaska, and you'll see 5 of the same 12 whales feeding together again. So we're really only just getting an idea what's going on in the social side of this, but the feeding side of it, obviously it's very efficient. They take about 1,000 pounds of food a day per whale. But this food has got to keep them going right through the year because they're only going to feed while they're in Alaskan waters. When they make those massive migrations, they're actually going to be using the blubber that they've laid down during their Alaskan portion of their trip to keep them going. And I'm sincerely hoping that the blubber I've laid down on my cruise keeps me going for a little while longer yet. Now, I'm just going to come out and do this the other way because I found it wasn't playing properly, but I do want you guys to see what this looks like from underwater. So there we go. So these are all the sounds of the whales, and all these bubbles are produced by the whales. And here it is at the surface. So those will be kepling, herring, some sort of small schooling fish like that, sand lance perhaps. And there's the whale coming up. Woo! That gives you an idea, doesn't it? There's the baleen. Can you see the baleen? And these are the ventral pleats right here. And there's a scratch. Oh, that looks pretty good, doesn't it? Yeah. So that's what we were seeing the other night. So it was really kind of exciting for sure. Okay, just bear with me 1 minute. Right. So as exciting as our humpbacks were this week, I did want to talk about orca this afternoon too. So as well as seeing all these humpback whales that we've been seeing on this trip, this is probably one of the best trips I've heard of in years for orca sightings. So if you did see an orca, realize